Welcome to the Global Research News Hour, produced in cooperation with CKUW-FM Radio in Winnipeg and the Centre for Research on Globalization at globalresearch.ca. And here's your host, Michael Welch.
How does money from philanthropic foundations distort social and environmental movements? What unique role do the NGOs' avaz and purpose serve in fostering support for Western imperialist hegemony in the Global South? What are the limits to dissent among foundation-funded media? What are the new frontiers of social movement co-optation? How can grassroots activist movements overcome the influence of big-moneyed interests? On this week's Global Research News Hour, we speak to two researchers who have studied the so-called non-profit industrial complex and its impacts on grassroots efforts to challenge the powers that be. My guests are London-based writer and investigative journalist Cory Morningstar and Boston-based blogger and investigative journalist Bob Feldman. On this week's program, the non-profit industrial complex and the parallel left, a conversation with Cory Morningstar and Bob Feldman. Bringing you the analysis beyond the media headlines, the Global Research News Hour is on the air. Welcome to the Global Research News Hour for the week of May 11th, 2018. I'm your host, Michael Welch. The Global Research News Hour is a special radio collaboration between the Centre for Research on Globalization and campus community radio station CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg on occupied Anishinaabe territory on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We seek to provide listeners with access to analysis of some of the major issues shaping our world today from thinkers, researchers, and unique political personalities rarely addressed by major media. Our programs are available at the website globalresearch.ca. We'll begin our show with News Notes, a sampling of articles from the Global Research News site. Following Netanyahu's speech, the White House released a statement of its own, saying Israel's intelligence confirms what the U.S. had already known, that, quote, Iran has a robust clandestine nuclear weapons program that it has tried and failed to hide from the world, unquote. Not long after, the White House issued a second statement that changed the word has to had, appearing to suggest that Iran no longer possesses a nuclear weapons program. However, a White House official later explained to NBC News that the wrong tense was the result of a quote-unquote clerical error. Either way, despite the uncompromising anti-Iranian narrative, the prevailing truth appears to be that Iran is in full compliance with the JCPOA, and the main officials involved, including Trump and Netanyahu, are well aware of this. In his April 12th Senate confirmation hearing, then CIA Director Mike Pompeo, who this week began his tenure as Secretary of State, said he has, quote, seen no evidence that they, Iran, are not in compliance today, unquote. That comes from the article, Iran Isn't Violating the JCPOA Nuclear Agreement, America Is, by Darius Shatamasebi, posted May 4th, originally appearing at the Anti-Media. On Tuesday, the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, issued an assessment in response to Netanyahu's speech, firmly asserting that there are, quote, no credible indications, unquote, supporting Netanyahu's claims of a continued Iranian nuclear weapons program after 2009. According to the AP summary of the IAEA assessment, the UN nuclear agency says it believes that Iran had a coordinated nuclear weapons program in place before 2003, but found no credible indications of such work after 2009. The documents focused on Iranian activities before 2003 and did not provide any explicit evidence that Iran has violated its 2015 nuclear deal with the international community. The IAEA statements followed on the heels of a number of international Iran analysts weighing in to say there appeared nothing new in terms of evidence, which Netanyahu confidently presented as if it were an open and shut bombshell revelation of Iranian malfeasance. That comes from the article, Trump all but decided to withdraw from Iran deal as IAEA refutes Netanyahu's speech. Posted May 3rd, originally appearing at Zero Hedge. What Netanyahu said about the Iranian nuclear program was chestnut. Since the mid-1990s, he is repeating this worn-out stuff like a mantra. He didn't present a single new argument, but for Donald Trump, it will be enough evidence to ultimately scarp the nuclear deal, what he wanted to do from day one of his presidency. The last person in his administration, Defense Secretary James Mattis, still sticks to reality and has declared many times that the Iranian government upholds its obligations. Since Trump kicked out the last moderate members of his cabinet, the U.S. embarked on a course of a war. That comes from the article Netanyahu's Anti-Iranian Reality TV Show by Dr. Ludwig Watzal, posted May 1st. These are just a few of the featured articles appearing last week on the Global Research website. Regular visitors to the site are encouraged to send monetary contributions by fax, mail, or online. Just go to globalresearch.ca and click Donate on the menu bar. My name is Michael Welch, and the program is the Global Research News Hour, recording this week's interview from Radio Western CHRW 94.9 FM here at the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Luna, Piwak, and Attawandaron peoples. Many listeners of this program are by now familiar with the role of corporate advertising in shaping the content and focus of mainstream media broadcasts. Along with the manufacture of consent of the body politic goes the manufacture of dissent, where social, labor, environmental, anti-war movements get co-opted in sophisticated ways. One of the principal mechanisms by which the process is orchestrated is through what is called the nonprofit industrial complex, a web of NGOs interconnected with state and corporate entities which channel activist energies in directions that ultimately don't undermine and, more often than not, further the ambitions of the elite of the elite. Cory Morningstar is all too familiar with this dynamic. She has written about the NPIC for close to a decade now. Cory Morningstar is an independent investigative journalist, writer, and environmental activist. Her recent writings can be found on Wrong Kind of Green, The Art of Annihilation, Political Context, Counterpunch, Canadians for Action on Climate Change, and Countercurrents. She joins us here at the studios of Radio Western. It's great to chat with you again, Cory.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
And joining us by phone from Boston, Massachusetts, is Bob Feldman. And Bob is he's also an investigative journalist, and he is, for more than a decade, he has been researching the role of philanthropic foundation funding in compromising the perspectives of the alternative print and broadcast media that depend on such funding for their operations. So thank you for joining us, Bob.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
For the sake of those who might be skeptical-minded, what would you say to those people who say, well, there's no quid pro quo? I mean, it's great that the Rockefellers or the DuPonts or whoever donate this money. I mean, we need that money if we're going to, stop this pipeline, or we're going to get the messaging out, or set up this website.
But all you have to do is look at what progress have we made. We have made no progress. I mean, emissions are through the roof. What are we at now? 410 parts per million. Countries are being all over. You've got U.S., NATO states all over the whole globe conquering, invading, occupying. We've made no progress. I know.
Yeah, the thing about it is that it's since early 1970s that the foundation money has been pouring in, trying to convert the environmentalist movement into, sustainable development. I mean, Joan Roloff, in her book Foundations in Public Policy, mentions this fact. Natural Resources Defense Council, CERA, Club Legal Defense, all these groups they've gotten this foundation money, yet it's 50 years later, and it hasn't achieved the reversal. So we have to ask ourselves, why? Why has the movement, why do we end up with Trump in 2017, 2018, and there's been a lot of the information is there's a new book out by David Callahan. He's Inside Philanthropy. He's the editor, and it's called The Givers: Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. And he has a sentence I'd like to read because it kind of summarizes what's happened. He says like progressives always talk about the right wing being funded by the right wing foundations and correctly criticize that. But he has this quote. He says, progressives have been largely silent about how, quote, charitable, unquote, dollars are influencing politics and policy, often with deeper impact than the campaign spending the left so fervently wants to restrict. You can see why progressives keep mum on this issue. Its advocates are especially dependent on philanthropy. And, growing up, I thought, well, foundations, they're helping the people. And then I read C. Wright Mills' book, The Power Elite, in which he mentioned, well, foundations are a tax dodge. And so, I thought, well, yeah, but maybe they're still helping to fund good things. But then 50 years ago, in '68 at Columbia, the radical students, SDS, in alliance with Harlem and the Afro-American Society, took over and we made some demands. And then there's a police bust. And then everyone was radicalized. Everyone was talking revolution on the campus. Then what happened is that to split these students, the moderates from the revolutionary students, the Ford Foundation came in with a $40,000 grant for students to fund students for a restructured university. And the idea was that SDS was saying that what we wanted a revolutionary society, society free of militarism, free of racism. But the Students for Restructured Society, funded by the Ford Foundation, they said, no, let's just focus on changing the university, limiting the demands. And at that point, it was a $40,000 grant, which is equivalent to $300,000 in 2018 money. And at that point, I realized that, hey, this is what the foundations are about, manipulating movements, insurgent movements. And today, of course, you have not only example of the, what wrong kind of green articles that Cory has written, explained, but you also have in terms of Black Lives Matter and, Center, the Color of Change, for instance, got in 2017 $7.5 million, So it's an attempt to limit, and manipulate what kind of issues the activists are going to prioritize and what their tactics are going to be. Because if they get too out of the parameters of what the agenda of those who control the foundations are, and the foundations themselves are directed off by corporate directors, then the funding ends.
What you're saying there is quite interesting, and you're speaking of that split, a split between the kind of resistance they can live with and the kind that we want to try to eclipse. And Cory, I just wanted to turn to you if you could maybe help us visualize the difference that you see this foundation money making as it's playing out, like what the environmental movement could be without the foundation money's intrusion versus what we're seeing coming out now.
Yeah, well, I think, you look back and, I wasn't there, but you read about even the Black Panthers and their breakfast programs, and actually tangible things in the community, right? And now today it's like, well, I'm going to give $50 to Greenpeace this year. I've done my part. I mean, we've lost that sense of community and working with each other as adults, as parents, as as humans, where we need to take responsibility for our own issues. We've basically, I think, been happy to give these problems onto the NGOs as part of it. So, and like Bob was saying too, with the money, there's a lot of conditions, and so you get people. You don't even have to censor, and the people involved, the journalists, the NGOs. They've become adept at self-censorship, and a lot of these millions of dollars given happen. There are 5 years. I mean, you get a certain amount every year, so if you bite the hand that feeds you, that money, that check will not be there the following year.
I know that there was a report that came out a few years ago by McDonald Stainsby and Drew Oya J that commented on foundation funding and how it's distorted tar sands activism. And so we don't see the level of opposition to tar sands as a result.
Yeah, I mean, the tar sands, one way or another, that oil will make it to the market where there's a demand. That oil, like water through a pipe, will find its way one way or another to escape. Eventually it finds a route to get out. And that what we don't talk about is, if we don't want oil, what are we willing to give up? Well, in fact, we're willing to give up nothing, because that would put a damper on economic growth, and you need economic growth to keep this economic system going. Capitalism, if it stalls, it collapses, so we can't have that. So this whole focus on the pipelines, you've got thousands of pipelines all over the whole planet, and we put all the focus on North America on a single pipeline. Well, then the oil quietly in the background all switches to rail. And then you've got Warren Buffett, ends up making billions, tens and tens of billions of dollars on rebuilding a rail dynasty in North America, while everyone's focused on a single pipeline, right? No one notices it's all being done in the background, and there's absolutely no dissent to that. And then that horrible, horrible accident in Montreal that killed almost 50 people from the oil. The rail accident with the oil. I mean, now we have the same thing happening in BC. We've got oil being diverted to Portland and being put onto ships to Asia. I mean, the oil's going to get to the market. So to not look at this, what is the purpose? Do we want to stop this pipeline, or do we want to stop oil? If we want to stop oil, what are we willing to give up? What are we wanting to discontinue? And the nonprofit industrial complex, the NGOs, that have the basically take up all the breathing room on the space, they don't want you to give up anything. I mean, there's no talk really of changing the way we live in the West. The fact of the matter is, here, 1% of the population's creating almost all the emissions on the planet. There's a tiny percentage of people doing all the damage. We don't talk about that, So we're not talking about systemic change. We're talking about how can we have everything we already have, plus have a lot more, and do it in a clean, environmentally, ecologically sound way. Well, there is no way, right?
Yeah, and I know, Bob, you... it seems to me, I mean, you've got a series out right now on your blog, wherechangeobama.blogspot.ca, and I know that in one of the, it's part of a 14-part series. I think there are more coming, but I think you did mention that there was some awareness way back when about the dangers of this kind of funding, and that I don't know if the awareness just went away, or if people became indifferent. I mean, what have been the changes, or when did you see this, acceptance of foundation funding as perhaps a necessary evil, or a vehicle for this for pursuing whether it's media or activism?
Started to a certain degree in terms of the Black liberation movement in the
Yeah.
late 60s. They posed a threat, a systemic threat. And then the Ford Foundation came in and started, and Rockefeller Foundation started funding black capitalism, and poured in lots of money to the Urban League, NAACP. And then within the anti-war movement and peace movement, I think it started in terms of maybe the 80s, nuclear freeze. And so you had the sad thing that at that point in the early 80s, 800,000 people marched against nuclear war in June of 1982. And then there was a contingent saying, well, if the Israeli military is invading, is bombing Beirut, is invading Lebanon, we're for peace. That should be a priority also of this march. And there was a contingent saying that, but then the organizers said, no, you can't talk about opposing Israeli militarism. And then in the late 80s and 90s, early 90s, that's when groups like Pacifica started seeking the foundation funding, and then alternative media groups started to seek it and get it.
I mean, look at Democracy Now! Beating the drums for war on Libya, and I mean, I don't listen to Democracy Now!, but I am pretty sure Syria as well. I mean, look at the so-called left beating drums for war. Like that's unbelievable in this day and age. Like, how can we fall for the same stories? Rinse, recycle, repeat, like basically the same old stories over and over for so-called humanitarian intervention. And we have the left, the liberal left, journalists and liberal left media, completely, again, like echoing through the chambers, these pro-war propaganda.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that on Libya, Syria, and also in 1999 on the quote humanitarian military intervention in Serbia, Yugoslavia. It didn't echo Michael Parenti's opposition. It took a different stand. Democracy Now!, which demonized Milosevic, which echoed. I mean, it was opposed to the war, but it echoed aspects of what the Democratic Party and the State Department was saying, and part was because on situations like Libya, in Syria, and 9/11, and and the 1999 war, if you get if you appear too anti-war and not willing to concede certain points about that the media is pushing about the illegitimacy of the regime that the U.S. government wants to change, whether it's Syria or Libya or in Serbia, then the funders, the funding goes, and it's self-censorship, really. It isn't that it isn't that Bill Moyers, who's given 1.1 million since 2013 to fund Democracy Now!, his Schumann Media Center. It isn't that he's going to say, tell you not to do a lot of investigative reporting segments after 2013, 50 years after the Kennedy assassination, have like a whole series on Democracy Now!. But the reality is that since he's funding Democracy Now!, and since Bill Moyers was LBJ's aide for 3 years after Kennedy was assassinated, he maybe doesn't want that emphasized. And then since he's Bill Moyers, who's redefined himself since that time, people, they just won't get into that. And then anybody who thinks, well, we should explore these particular historical events in greater detail, they're either called conspiracy theorists or The other thing is Johnny One Notes. The listeners aren't interested in, you know. But I think the thing about the foundations is that early in the 20th century, there was a lot of criticism on the left of foundations because it was seen as undemocratic. It was seen as, well, Rockefeller, Carnegie, they got their money by exploiting workers in vicious ways, exploiting consumers in vicious ways, unethical business practices, making weapons of death in some cases. And these plutocrats shouldn't then be able to redefine themselves and fund groups it was undemocratic, that their power should be taken away. But you got a situation now where they make their money in immoral means, and they continue to. The foundations also invest in those corporations that are responsible for the destruction of the earth and for systemic racism and for militarism. The foundations still have investments in those corporations, and at the same time they use some of the profits, the dividends they get from those investments to fund the groups which purportedly are either reporting on on the harm done by the corporations or fighting against the policies, the results of the policies of these corporations. And what's left off the hook is the foundations themselves are tied in with the systemic problems that people want to see eradicated. It's a way the foundations become a means of the 1% to block kind of these kind of structural and systemic
I think
change.
our movements represent very much a part of that same 1%. I mean, the staff at Avaz make around $200K a year. I mean, we're talking elite status, and you can look straight across the board. Sierra Club, all the big ones, they're making huge six-figure salaries. You know, some of them $400,000 or $500,000 a year, and then they're asking seniors to send in, their checks for $5 a month. I mean, it's.
Oh yeah, Democracy Now! Is a good example. Like I glanced at it today before early in the morning, and I noticed they say, well, if you send in our money, a supporter will match it 3 times, but they don't name their supporter.
Exactly.
Who's the supporter. At the same time, they don't disclose on their website the amount of money that they've received in recent years from various foundations, like a former vice president of Microsoft for 10 years, Rob Glazer, his foundation, the Glazer Progress Foundation. They've given 15 since 2001, $1.2 million, to fund Democracy Now! And Democracy Now!, doesn't probably. I don't think it's done that many segments on exposing the negative role historically and even currently of Microsoft. It's work for the military. Microsoft, for instance, just got a $927 million contract to work for the Pentagon, provide software, help the Pentagon do what it's doing around the world. And part of why they might not do this is because at one point, one of their chief funders was involved with Microsoft for 10 years, helped build it up. But part of why all the other things, also the economic thing, is that Amy Goodman, she gets $160,000 a year, total compensation. Most people don't know that. The salaries, you had to get the salaries. You have to go look on the Form 990 that all these NGOs file, and it's often hard. It's not easy to find because a lot of people either aren't going to look on it, and often the forms aren't completely filled out, or not filled out until later. But there's, like Cory says, there's a lot of money within this NGO world, this nonprofit industrial complex. It matches, enables people to, without working in the 9-to-5 world, you get an alternative job and live quite well, not live on the average salary of most movement activists who are grassroots, or on most working people, in the world. Not not even the United States,
You're listening to the Global Research News Hour, broadcast out of Winnipeg on campus community radio station CKUW 95.9 FM and on partner radio stations across Canada and the United States. We are also podcast on the website, globalresearch.ca. That cuts you off from the broader grassroots community because you're sort of in a separate world where you're more inclined to mingle with some of those elites than with the your feel that same sense of solidarity.
Yeah,
also the other thing is, let's say we're in a movement group. If we all sit in the room and we all, we're doing it. People are like, working 9 to 5, and then they go in the evening. But then somebody else is one person in the room. If you're talking about, well, what are we going to do, about fighting what this corporation is doing, or on this issue, the person in the room who's backed as part of the NGO, has the economic basis to have more influence, and has, over what's going to happen, and I mean, there's a group called Plowshares, for instance, the Plowshares Fund, and they focus on stopping nuclear war. And and they've gotten since 2015, they've gotten $2.7 million from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And then what they do is then they distribute it to a lot of grantees. If you go to their website, you can see all their grantees that they distribute, and like 20 of them within the peace movement. And most of those grantees just focus on the nuclear war issue and don't focus on the wars that are being waged now that aren't that don't involve nuclear weapons.
Yeah, because you can't talk about imperialism, right?
Yeah, exactly right, and that's the common thing, that instead of building an anti-imperialist revolutionary movement that would that would go against the system, you have the foundations. You use the NGOs, thousands of NGOs that end up fragmenting the movement, And the funny part is that when Bernie Sanders ran in 2016, he talked about political revolution. He didn't talk about economic revolution. He didn't talk about other kinds of revolutions that we need, but he used the word revolution. I was thinking when he ran that all these, if you listen to Democracy Now, and a lot of these other media's there's rarely any talk of allowing people who are calling for revolution now against the 1%, using that word day in and day out, calling for an economic, political revolution, and instead you have a mindset which is what I call the 30-year, gradualism, Yet the thing is, we need immediate change. The Poor People's Movement is talking about when they're going to have their demonstrations Monday, trying to continue what Martin Luther King did in '68. It's gotten some publicity in the alternative media world, and to an extent it has some foundation funding, but it talks about the 4 things that people could be focusing on, which again would fighting systemic racism, fighting environmental destruction, fighting poverty, and fighting the war economy. Those 4 things people could unite on, but yet because we have all these thousands of NGOs, and this fragmented movement, foundation subsidized movement, people don't unite in a way that they did in the 60s around fighting a imperialist society that's trying to keep the empire, and is responsible for so many deaths the last 30 years, and then of course even before, and so you don't have the kind of reaction that there should have been when they attacked Libya, and in terms of the covert war in Syria. That instead people are in these NGOs, in their NGO offices, in a fragmented way, and then calling demonstrations about this issue, that issue, this issue, that issue, and yet if you look at the starvation and the cost, for the economic costs of imperialism around the globe, yet there isn't this sense of urgency. And I attribute part of it is because if each year the grant comes through to the NGO, and then the NGO, calls its protests and gets some people out, there's no, it's a different form of activism than what we historically had, and it's undemocratic because what's driving it is still the same plutocrats who control the corporations.
You're listening to the Global Research News Hour. This week's show is dedicated to the non-profit industrial complex and the parallel left, and it's being recorded out of the studios at Radio Western CHRW 94.9 FM at the University of Western Ontario. And our show, of course, airs on CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg and on partner radio stations across Canada and the United States. I'm your host, Michael Welch, and I'm joined by London-based Cory Morningstar, and from Boston, Bob Feldman. And, of course, just following up on your last comments there, Bob, I wanted to draw attention to some of the work that a couple of essays that Cory had written last year. And I'm just going to pull up a quote, because it speaks to not only propagandizing, but social engineering. Here's the quote. Today's so-called environmental leaders and human rights activists are not yet genetically engineered. Rather, they are socially engineered experiments decanted from Harvard, Yale, Rockwood Leadership Institute, and other institutions of indoctrination that serve and expand the global hegemony. One could theorize that today's 21st century activism is a new process of mimesis, the millennial having assimilated into spectacle, far removed from both nature and reality. So I'm just wondering, maybe just your thoughts about this idea that, we're not just talking about propaganda lines where, Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction, we got to go to war. We're talking about shaping people's behavior. So could I maybe get you to address that and how you've seen this evolving?
It's like redefining. What's been redefined is what fighting the power is about. What creating meaningful changes. What's been thrown into what's been forgotten is the whole history of institutional resistance. Just as what's been forgotten is how the funders and the foundations have gotten that money. It's ahistorical. Part of I've been writing about foundations for since 1996. I wrote for Downtown, which wasn't funded by foundations, and this time around, what I kind of realized in terms of writing it in the pay of foundations is it's not. I couldn't just mention, well, it gets foundation funding, and therefore, hey, it's a synthetic kind of and a kind of morally contradictory. That people wouldn't necessarily understand. I had it because a lot of people they don't understand on gut level that, well, why foundations? What's so bad about foundations? So I kind of included more research as to, well, how did Henry Ford get his money? What did he do? How was the Ford Foundation funded? What's its history? Or something like the Public Welfare Foundation. What was it? Where did that money come from? What did they do? How did Charles Marsh, who was LBJ's backer in Texas and into oil, how did he get his money? And to try to get that, but I think that's part of the thing is that people are the people who grew up in my time, 50s and 1960s, were socialized a little differently than the people who were socialized later and then went to, like you say, there's a whole thing of the whole prep schools and the elite. Most people don't know that Bill Gates, for instance, his grandfather on his mother's side, Maxwell, was a big banker. Actually, the great grandfather, and the grandfather was also into banking, first into the state bank, and left him a trust fund. This whole Silicon Valley thing, and the whole computer millionaires. Part of the thing is that they've used. It's funny because they've used the rhetoric of the '60s of we're changing the world to perpetuate a vicious imperialist system, and they get away with it because the thing you mentioned in terms of the elite students at all these elite universities being socialized in a certain way, and then also coming from a different generation than the 50s and 60s,
I think people today think that history doesn't matter, that it's in the past, it's irrelevant, things aren't
Right,
like that
yeah.
anymore, right? But the truth is these foundations are invisible, that the NGOs are at the forefront and they play an invisible role. And today they're more powerful than they've ever been in the past. There's trillions, literally trillions of dollars pumped into the nonprofit industrial complex, which at this point, I was speaking to my peer, my comrade Forrest Palmer, a couple weeks ago, and I said, I feel like we need to start calling this the nonprofit industrial spectacle. It's just become absolutely ridiculous. There's a new NGO of late I've sort of started watching called Global Citizen. They actually, if you can imagine, they have rewards now for activism. Like think of air miles, all those points rewards that you use to shop. So activism has been completely commodified to the point now the partners and sponsors involved with Global Citizen will reward you for doing an action with rewards, whether it's concert tickets. It's all tied into celebrity, which is a huge part of activism. Not to mention, this really is the nonprofit industrial complex is an actual army. Right? This is an arm of empire. This is an army that's funded and paid for by the elites that fund this complex to perpetuate and protect and further their power, to extend it even further. And I think that's really important to understand. That's what it's for. That's why the trillions of dollars, and they can mobilize their army. If you look at the numbers, it's actually staggering how many people are employed by NGOs and nonprofits, all which, make up the nonprofit industrial complex. It's a massive part of the economy, just like militarism. And so they're able to really, really shape and mold entire agendas and actually whole society by mobilizing their employees, their staff. You think of millions of people all basically echoing the same message through the media and the all the different media devices, and all of a sudden you've created this huge, what feels like momentum, but it's all engineered. Yeah. Hence our how we continue to devolve and how our movements continue to lose any importance.
Cory, I just wanted to draw you to, because I've read, like last year, you did an update on your research on Avaz and purpose, which, purpose is, like they're linked. And they are very notable because it links the environmentalism with the imperialist agendas in Syria. And so I just was wondering, because that is, it seems to me it's taking that social engineering to a new level.
Okay, so if you look back, there's an old photograph I found. It's Bob Hunter, one of the original co-founders of Greenpeace in Canada. He has a T-shirt on, and on the T-shirt he has written across it, black marker, and he's at a meeting, right? He's sitting in on a meeting. He's all scruffy. It looks like he just came in from the garden or from work. I mean, that was the real deal back then, about real things, protecting nature. Now today, Greenpeace is at the forefront, right up there with Avaz, Oxfam. There's like basically a top 20 that works hand in hand with the UN, and basically run the social movements across the world, mold them, shape them. Social engineering, tick tick tick, like basically Greenpeace, 350, and Oxfam, which are the three biggest, created tick tick tick. They took this type of social engineering to a whole new level. In 2000, when was that? 2009 at COP21. You saw them basically undermine all the most vulnerable states in the planet at that climate conference, and you look back at documents, Greenpeace documents from around 1990, where they cited 1 degree as a temperature that the planet could not exceed. Well, in 2009, they demanded a full 2 degrees, what the corporations wanted. So we continue to grow the economy at the expense of all life on the planet. So you can see that huge, it's not even the same thing anymore. These NGOs are an arm of the elite. They're an apparatus of the establishment and empire. So Avaz and Purpose. Purpose is the for-profit PR firm, basically the sister org of Avaz. I would say they're the most powerful NGO in the world, aside from 350, which was incubated by the Rockefeller Foundation and started with the Rockefeller Foundation and the Clinton Foundation. And again, that's hand in hand with Avaz, one of the most powerful NGOs in the world right now as well. Anyway, what they do now, we've been engineered to such an extent that we don't even notice. We no longer fight to protect nature, to protect trees. We're fighting for windmills. We're fighting for solar panels. We're fighting to continue a very rich way of life for a small number of people. That's what the environment movement is today, and that's what I call not environmentalism, but basically
Anthropocentrism?
Anthropocentrism. It's completely, it's pragmatism. It's full. This is business. This is big business. Now you've got Avaz, Purpose. The main overall arching campaign of all of them now is this huge push for renewable energies, which is actually a huge push for further imperialism. You can call it green imperialism, eco-imperialism. It's just as dirty. It's just another growth industry, and today they want to basically steal from the treasuries, and now we're going to pump trillions and trillions, about $60 trillion, $90 trillion into creating a brand new, basically, global infrastructure, renewable energy, which is, what's that based on? That's based on further exploitation, further of brothers and sisters all over the planet, mining, all dirty industry, further industry for a very few, people.
Yeah, beyond the fact that lithium mining is not necessarily without its toxic concerns, and of course, and other rare earth minerals, which is mining. This call for electrification of the grid. It's not likely going to do anything.
No,
I think
you've got Bill McKibben right now in Africa. Flying to Africa. What do they need Bill McKibben in Africa for? I don't know. But they've got him. What was the article? I don't know. Rolling Stone, New York Times, what have you, saying how amazing it was that he was in Africa and this little village with their few solar panels or whatever they have now. They all have a TV. Well, what the hell do they need a TV for, right? Like, that's progress. It's just upside down now with technology and our values, what we see as progress. And,
I think that whole rap that Cory gave, it's like, that's the kind of thing that should be talked about on the foundation subsidized, shows that are on daily, like Democracy Now. I mean, but and the thing is, yet if you start talking about the NGO, and the foundations, that doesn't happen as much, and so you get a situation where people don't necessarily know what's going on, and so that undercuts the whole original mission of what an alternative left media was supposed to be about. When you're not allowing a lot of dissident grassroots movement people on there.
So I think
that's what's holding back, and what has held back, especially the last 20 years, has held back the growth of a movement that's really effective.
I think we're running pretty much close to the end of our time. I was wondering if each of you might want to have a few suggestions about, if we wish to hold on or foster the movements and media that are not to be captured by these elite interests with their hegemonic agendas. What advice would you make for in terms of being able to do that, to maintain that sovereign and make sure that we do make room for these dissenting voices?
I'll go first because I'm probably far less optimistic than Bob. I don't really have a lot of hope for that. I don't think anything's going to change a lot until it has to change. Some sort of catastrophic event or some sort of collapse, which will eventually happen because this can't go on forever. But I feel like, I often wonder if we've just been socially engineered to be so incredibly passive, like perhaps we're not even, we've just, we don't even have the capacity anymore to really, fight the fight. We're just so incredibly passive and polite, and that's, all a part of social engineering. Even even that aspect in the whole, direct action thing versus, you can't even talk about tactics. Like, it can only be nonviolent direct action. Well, and basically, if you have anything else to say but that, you're ostracized, and basically outcast. You're isolated completely. I mean, you can't ask, what is the Assata Shakur quote? I can't think of it off the top of my head, but basically you're begging your oppressor, for to do what you want. It's just never going to happen. And so I think we're really, really comfortable here. I don't see things changing. We're being trained to devolve where we're not educating ourselves, we're not seeking out information, we're becoming mentally lazy. It's too much work to research, it's too much work to learn. You want all your information in 140 characters, and without the history, without understanding the history of where we've been, of where the environmental movement's been, the history, the critical importance of the foundations and the interlocking dictorate, and unless we understand how power functions and how it can use us to advance its own desires, I think we're really just spinning our wheels.
Okay, Bob, do you have any thoughts about preserving truly independent media and grassroots activism going forward?
Yeah, well, I think the thing is that things can change, very rapidly. I mean, you had the Occupy Wall Street thing, which initially came from at least a lot of the people from below, and then you push the idea of the 1%. Now, the media has the alternative media. If people press them at the same time engage in what I call institutional resistance, there's some of the system is in crisis worldwide. It's in crisis here, and the way I look at it is that the exclusion of grassroots dissident radical left environmentalists and others is a sign of the weakness and the fear of those of the 1%, those who hold power. Because if they weren't afraid that if they gave us access, there'd be a response. To prove that how liberal and tolerant they were, they'd allow these kinds of discussions within their alternative media world and within the mainstream media world. But I think the fact that there is this high level of censorship, the fact that read Global Research News, all those people who are on there and who get posted there, but you never hear them on Democracy Now, and the other shows, I think that's because there'd be a response, and things can change very rapidly. I mean, we can be in a big war, and at that point, there'll be an attempt to co-opt the movement, but often that doesn't work. I mean, the lessons of '68 shows that they couldn't co-opt, at least for the 2 years from '68 to '70. They had to then repress. So I think that history can change very fast, and the level of crisis in terms of the Earth, is so dire that people might be forced to press for more immediate change. So I guess I'm not.
Maybe when they have to change.
Yeah.
Change.
I guess I'm not as pessimistic as you are, Cory. The key thing, as I see it, is using the mass media power and that alternative media to pressing those who have the daily access to the 1,400 stations, to let it on a whole range of people who have been excluded.
Yeah. I guess, and on that note, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that, for all those listeners who've listened to this program, they probably get by now that philanthropic donations is probably not the answer. So that would be probably an invitation to open up your wallets and support independent community radio stations like CHRW, like CKUW, as well as independent sites like Global Research. And so with that, I think it's time for us to say goodbye now. So thank you very much, Bob Feldman, investigative journalist from Boston.
Thanks for having.
And your website is wherechangeobama.blogspot.ca. And Cory Morningstar. And thank you for joining us.
Michael.
And you can find a lot of her essays at theartofannihilation.com.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Global Research News Hour. You can hear our program each week on CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg and on partner radio stations across Canada and the United States. You can also download our show from the website globalresearch.ca. To leave feedback on this program, email globalresearchnewshour@gmail.com. Many thanks this week to sister radio station Radio Western at CHRW 94.9 FM in London. For details on their station and programming, visit radiowestern.ca. Our next show will be dedicated to genetically modified agriculture, global food security, and the upcoming March Against Monsanto, and will feature a never-before-aired exclusive interview with Dr. Vandana Shiva. I've been your host, creator, and producer, Michael Welch. Join us again next week.